with the recent bull run, crypto is becoming more and more prevalent. So today we'll be talking about crypto and blockchain and how it ties into the other big tech and software developments. I've personally stayed away from crypto pretty much my entire life up until about 12 or 24 months ago when I had to get some crypto to buy some courses or some products online. But being a very late adopter of crypto, I'd love to learn more about how it ties into the recent tech developments and AI. And I would also eventually like to dive deeper into the rabbit hole of crypto and crypto trading and your outlook on the ethics of crypto. And who knows, maybe we'll do like a few of these episodes on crypto, similar to what we did with um, our episodes on running effective discovery. How does that sound?
That sounds awesome. Let's go.
I'm really curious, when did you get into crypto?
I first heard of crypto in 2010 when I stumbled on Satoshi's white paper. And it got me really, really excited about it. I started to talk to my friends about it. Hey guys, have you seen this whole thing called Bitcoin? It's going to be a new digital currency and it's going to be awesome. And unfortunately for me, for a lot of my friends, they're like, no, this is a bad idea. At that time, also there was kind of whole narrative that, yeah, this is going to be bad and the SEC is going to crack down on it. And that, yeah, this is not going to be legit. It's scams, it's bad. And so I kind of stayed away. I kind of started to look at it 2010, but I really got into it deeply in about 2015. And yeah, and I've seen all the bull runs, I've seen the bear markets, I've been part of the first decentralized autonomous organization called the DAO at the time. And we'll break that down. We'll break down what is a DAO, what's a decentralized autonomous organization. Uh, Lost a ton of money on exchanges. Quadriga CX was one of the exchanges that went bust in Canada, and I lost a lot of money there. But I've also made a fair amount of money as well since I've been kind of very very early into the game, and I've been passionate about it from the time it started because I believe in the potential. However, I still think it's still early days, believe it or not. We're what, 7, 8, 10 years in, and I still think it's still very early.
Why do you think it's early?
Adoption is the biggest hurdle. It's just like how many people have heard of crypto, how many people adopted crypto. It has not become mainstream yet. And I think it's the usability is the biggest issue. And then the second is really government regulation.
Mhm. So just in terms of the number of people that have started using crypto, we're not quite at that wide adoption scale yet. There's still a lot more to go.
Yes, and one way to measure this is to just see how many, for example, if you take a network like Ethereum, just look at how many addresses. So Ethereum currently is at 264 million addresses.
Mhm.
And if we look at world population, 2024, we are at 7.9 billion. So you just do the math, right? 264 million. Now, of course, there's a lot of these wallets or a lot of these addresses that are, maybe dormant wallets, bots,
Mhm.
algorithms running on the network. So it's very hard to kind of isolate how many of them are real people behind it. But if you just do the math between 240 million to 7 billion, still
Agreed.
early.
Agreed. My background with crypto started way after yours. In I think it was back in like 2014 when I first heard of crypto. I was like in high school, I was in grade 10, and then we had to do a presentation on tech and I recently discovered crypto and I understood nothing about it. But I made like a 10 slide presentation and it was just me like scraping the surface of it. I didn't understand anything. And then in 2018, I remember, or I think I should say late 2017, when crypto and block Bitcoin. I was going to say blockchain. Bitcoin hit its first peak at 10K, and that's when I started researching more intently into it and looking into mining. And I remember at the time, someone did the math, and because of the costs of mining and the amount of energy it took, it wasn't profitable to mine at the time. And then COVID hit, and then all of the West was like running out of GPUs on the market because everyone started mining, which to me is really interesting because I guess depending on the cost of Bitcoin, it may or may not make sense to start mining. But never really did any mining, never got any crypto up until about a year ago. But I've never really done any research into decentralized autonomous organizations. Mind explaining briefly what that is?
So the easiest way I can explain to you a decentralized autonomous organization is think of it as a company without a CEO and without a team. So the first one was called the DAO, and it was it was a grand experiment. They raised a ton of money. They actually raised the DAO. Yeah, so they raised essentially 200, and this was kind of the first exciting project on Ethereum. The team behind it was able to raise $250 million, and we also experienced one of the biggest hacks in the history of Ethereum. And the DAO is actually, at that time, it was the first it was the first hard fork of Ethereum after the hack.
What does a hard fork mean?
So what happened is essentially,
Sorry,
sorry,
might be lagging a little bit. What does a hard fork mean?
oof, we're gonna have to go very, very deep. Okay, so to explain what a hard fork means, we have to first understand kind of what the blockchain is and how does it work. And the easiest way we can explain the blockchain is essentially a series of blocks, and each block contains a number of transactions in it. And so you have like block one, and then block one is now pointing to, or there's going to be like block one, imagine it pointing to block two, and imagine it pointing to block three. And essentially what happens is every time a transaction comes on the network, it's mined and it ends up in a block. And a hard fork is essentially where you say, okay, something now is wrong. We don't want to continue on this path, and we go create another kind of parallel path where essentially like you go back to, let's say I have block one, block two, block three, and something went wrong on block two. And instead of linking it to block three, now we say, forget it, we hate this. We're going to roll back. We're going to go back to block two and now build the block four, for example, or call it three prime. And we're going to continue the history from here. Now, when something like this happens, it's actually really bad because one of the promises of the blockchain is that it should be immutable, that you cannot change it. And going back from block three to block two, it means things are going to change now. And we went back and negged back on our promise about block three, and now we're going to go to block three prime. Now, the cool thing about kind of how hard forks happen is that the miners and the people who use the network get to decide. They're going to get to vote. Because what happened actually at that time, Ethereum, the first ticker symbol for Ethereum was not ETH, it was actually ETC. And when people decided to hard fork it, you had the community essentially kind of broken down in half. So there are people who said, no, we refuse this fundamentally. We don't want to hard fork anything. We want to continue on the old Ethereum network. And then you had people who said, no, 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 we agree. This is like, this is a big hack. This is really, was really, really bad. People lost a lot of money, and we refuse to continue with the kind of the old network, and we're actually now going to jump on the new network. And that's actually when we kind of forked it into two currencies, ETC, and these are the people who continued on the old chain, and then ETH, and those are the people who said, yeah, we want to now move on to the new chain. And eventually everybody, jumped on board and got back on track, and this is kind of the current Ethereum we have today.
Gotcha. And bringing that back to DAO, you mentioned that DAO is basically um, an organization without like any kind of president or leadership. In that case, like what's the goal of
Yes.
that organization in the first place?
So the purpose of any organization is more or less to make money. But imagine that as opposed to running it by a CEO with a vision, the community actually votes on proposals. So the idea is community members who are part of the DAO will come up with proposals and say, hey, here's an initiative, here's how we want to make money, here is a project, let's call it a project that we want to do. And then the community gets to vote. And if the majority of the community says, okay, yes, we want to do this project, then automatically some of the money that is held by the DAO gets kind of released or allocated to that project, and now the people responsible for that project go and execute on it, right? Think if you kind of compare it to what happens in any big company, we kind of do the same thing, right? Like in a company, you kind of say, I want to launch a product, and so everybody on the team gets on board, works, launches the product, and and then you take it to market, and then if you're successful, you kind of get to make money, and you send it back to the company, and now everybody on the team kind of makes money, and then the
Right.
investors of the company make money. So it's kind of the same promise, just done in a decentralized fashion.
And that's super interesting because to me that sounds like chaos.
It's an experiment, right? I think we've had the structure of companies that we've had for the longest time, and it was a $250 million experiment in, is there another way to create companies, especially in this new world where we have blockchain, and we can raise money and we can allocate money on chain. Uh, and I would argue that a lot of the project structure or the crypto projects that launch at this time, they run, I wouldn't say they run, as a decentralized autonomous organization, but community gets to vote on a lot of decisions that are made by the crypto team. And I believe, I would attribute it to kind of the first DAO experiment.
Gotcha. Did Bitcoin start with a DAO? Or I guess it goes way, way back, but
No, DAO the Bitcoin was kind of the OG currency. The DAO was
mm,
enabled by Ethereum. So you go, if I want to kind of look at the crypto history, and then we can pull a chart of this. You have BTC, then Vitalik Buterin, looks at the Bitcoin white paper, spends about a year or a year and a half or 2 years kind of like writing about Bitcoin and researching Bitcoin, and then he writes the first Ethereum white paper. And when he did that, people got really excited about Ethereum, and one of the first projects that were on Ethereum was the DAO.
that's really interesting. And it's also funny to think about Vitalik. I've never met him personally, but he went to my university and I think dropped out at a certain point because Ethereum really took off. But I remember back in 2017, a buddy of mine was telling me that he was banking a whole bunch of money into Ethereum, and to me it seemed like a scam. Um, but obviously, I didn't understand anything, and he probably made bank from that. Now it's been I think like 6, 7, 8 years at this point. But as a CTO, if you were to divide up crypto tech into categories, what would that look like?
So when the blockchain first started, or when crypto first started, it was simple. There was only one category, which is what we'll call them now layer ones. Layer ones, a good example of them is Bitcoin is kind of considered layer one. Ethereum, Binance, Solana, Cardano. These are, if you think about them, these are the foundational frameworks or the foundational blockchains that a lot of other things, other protocols, other kind of or other categories of things go on top of, right? So if we take the example of Ethereum, Ethereum is the layer one where it's, and you can, one way we can refer to it is the settlement layer where all the transactions happen and things roll out into these transactions and go in blocks. Now, over the years, what happened is DAOs, right? We kind of talked about the first DAO. So the DAO is another category of projects. Then after that, the big one was DeFi. Decentralized finance became the next one. And decentralized finance, what we mean by that is, think of all the verbs that you use in finance today. So when we talk about finance, we talk about lending money, we talk about borrowing money, we talk about being able to buy and sell assets. And so DeFi came along, and there was a whole kind of DeFi bull run that happened. And this allowed also kind of the concept of what we call DEXs or decentralized exchanges. So think of layer one as the foundational internet of money, and then think of DeFi as here's the finance aspect of this. After that, you have also GameFi or gaming. So gaming became a big thing in the last bull run. So that's another category in itself. NFTs and communities are another category or broad category. Meme coins, or known as shit coins, is a whole other category in itself. And I feel this year it's actually one of the bigger narratives. What else? And then we have this year, the big thing is going to be crypto plus AI, which is another narrative, and it's a whole other ecosystem. And it's really cool to kind of be on the ground and look at what happens. So, you start with one project that defines a category, and then you have 15, 100, 200 projects that kind of pop up that are trying either to do the same thing or take the idea and try to do it a little bit better and a little bit better. And this is pretty much, it's fascinating to see, when an ecosystem or when a category starts, there's like maybe one or two projects in that category. And then eventually over time, that category blows up and it becomes its own thing. And this is what's happening right now with crypto AI, which is becoming its own ecosystem. And under that ecosystem, there's a lot of categories there.
Gotcha. And bringing that back a little bit to layer two being DeFi. Um, I heard the words lending money, borrowing money, buying and selling of assets. Isn't that like, to me, when I hear this, it sounds like crypto trading, or is this something completely different?
It's much but part of it is so I want to just go back and fix a couple of things. So you said layer two, and there is a whole category called layer twos, and
Mm,
it's different than DeFi. So there's DeFi and
okay.
there's layer twos, and layer twos essentially is, think of it as another blockchain layer that
Mm,
gives us speed and gives us transaction volume at cheaper cost. And this is especially relevant when we talk about Ethereum, because one of the biggest issues with Ethereum is gas is very, very expensive. The network is very, very congested. This is where layer two category popped up. For example, Arbitrum is a good example of a layer two protocol. And the goal of layer two protocols is to kind of speed up what happens in layer one. So Polygon is a good example of layer two, Immutable, Arbitrum, Optimism, Starknet. There's a ton of these protocols that said, hey, how do we make things cheaper and how do we make things faster and still rely on Ethereum as our base layer? Now, going back to your question, when we talk about trading, trading is part of the DeFi verbs. But think of lending and borrowing. This is not something that, you know, Ethereum itself doesn't support the concept of, oh, I'm going to lend Anatoly some money or Anatoly is going to borrow some money from me. And for that, you need protocols that go and define, what does it mean to lend money? And think of a good way to think about it is also compare it what happens in finance in the real world, right? If I walk into a bank and I say, hey guys, I need $1 million because I want to buy a home in Toronto, even though $1 million is not going to be enough. The bank is going to be like, okay, great, let's look at your credit score. Let's look at your credit history. Are you really good for it or not? In the blockchain world, there is no credit score. There isn't necessarily a history. So how do I, based on what am I going to give you? I'm going to give you money to borrow. So DeFi protocols kind of had to innovate and had to invent the concept of what does it mean to borrow money on the blockchain.
Gotcha. And who runs these DeFi lending processes?
It's projects. Think of them as other crypto projects that came to solve this problem. And there's like really awesome examples of them. And let's bring up a few. So if I go to categories, and you can see, by the way, all of these categories, if you go to GoingGecko, you go to categories, you can see a lot. Look how many categories we have in the blockchain. It's almost hundreds and hundreds of categories now, right? So you're kind of asking me to explain a really super broad ecosystem. Now, let's go quickly to DeFi. Okay, yeah, no, not DPI, let's just go DeFi. And we'll talk about some of the bigger ones and what do they mean. So staking, this is a primitive that doesn't exist in the regular finance world, right? Like there is no concept of staking. So, and we can maybe come back to that separately. But if I look at DeFi, Aave is a really great example. So let me actually jump to Aave's. So Aave allows me to borrow money. So I'll give you kind of a really cool use case, for example, for Aave. Let's say I have some ETH in my wallet and I know that ETH is going to appreciate in value. So I don't want to sell it. I'm happy with it. And what a protocol like Aave allows me to do is to give them my ETH as a security and then borrow money at a certain interest rate from them and then take this money and now go and invest it in some other protocols and make more money, which is borrowing. Now, we're not going to comment on leverage. Is it good? Is it bad? This is not the point. The point is, imagine that I can get to keep my ETH and hold it as a deposit or as a security and go borrow money against that security and now be able to invest it in other projects. That's how you can make more money with the money you have, right? Now, this will create a whole bunch of interesting things that can happen, right? Like what happens if, as opposed to my ETH going up, ETH goes down. So now whatever collateral I had on my loan now is depreciating in value. So now we go into kind of the concept of liquidation. So now the protocol itself, if let's say I put 500 ETH, borrowed 10 grand against it, and then the 500 ETH becomes $1 each. So now the protocol has to kind of de-risk, and so they might liquidate my assets now and take it. And this is kind of similar to what happens in normal finance, except this is not managed by people. It's managed on chain by smart contracts. Does that make sense? So you can see here that I can, if I give them my AVAX token, for example, I'm going to get 0.12% back. And if I borrow ETH or borrow AVAX, I can borrow it at 1.48%, etc., etc. So this is one protocol, but then there's other protocols that allow me to exchange tokens. We're gonna get into, there's a whole category called stable coins. There's other categories, for example, tokenized real estate. Um, and stable coins are like their own world that we can talk about, for example, USDT or a US dollar on chain, right? Or USDC, which is also another US dollar on chain. And there's different protocols that do the same thing, but in different ways, right? So USDT and USDC, the way they kind of control it is there's an organization, Tether organization, and it kind of, you have to, every time they need to issue on-chain dollars, they need to back it by off-chain dollars. But then you have protocols like Frax that doesn't do it in the same way. Frax deals with like, essentially Frax kind of backs up the dollar by other blockchain assets. So if I look at DeFi as a category, right? Look at the DeFi as a category. Uh, what is this number? 110. So this is millions, this is billion. $110 billion category, which is insane to think about it, right? And then
I
you
was
go
always
into, for
wondering
example,
how, I was just going to say, I was always wondering how USDT and USDC were backed up and what's the difference between the two. But that's really interesting to know.
so if you want to get into it, USDT and USDC, they're backed by treasuries. For the most part, there's a whole debate and there was a whole fiasco around whether it's really backed by treasuries or not. But for the sake of simplification, is that there's a Tether organization, and every time they need to issue dollars, there's demand for dollars. They go and buy U.S. treasuries and they hold them in trust, and then they issue dollars for them. Versus like a protocol like Frax will hold like ETH and Sol and other tokens,
Right.
and essentially they buy and sell to kind of maintain the value of the dollar. So they buy and sell
Gotcha.
other assets to kind of maintain parity with the dollar.
I'm very tempted to ask this, and this might be going off topic a little bit, but something that I've always kind of struggled with grasping around wallets is the protocols, because I know there's different protocols, and there's like ERC20, and then there's other ones. And during
Yes.
transactions, it becomes a challenge if you're on two different protocols because there's a
Yes.
likelihood of money going missing if you're sending, like, let's say USDT to a wallet that is not ERC20 that is running off of
Yes.
ERC20. Um,
And if you want
can
to
you just elaborate
understand
on
this,
that?
sure. And if you want to understand it, we need to go back to our layer ones, right?
Mhm.
So the reason this is tricky is we said for example, Ethereum is a layer one, Binance is a layer one, Solana is a layer one, and a project like Tether or USDT exists on each one of these chains. But these are separate technologies, they're separate blockchains. They don't talk to one another, they're not interoperable. And right, one of the big words that we'll use in this episode is what we call interoperability. Is that
Mm.
imagine you have internet one and it doesn't talk to internet two, right? And so if what you're trying to do, for in your example, if you try to send a USDT to an address on internet 2, what happens? Like you send it to an invalid address, so that money kind of goes to a black hole. However, there's a concept that's worth mentioning is what we call a bridge. So a lot of projects will create what's called a bridge between, for example, different layer ones, right?
Mm.
A good example of that is Solana. Solana has a bridge called Wormhole. Ethereum to, if I think about, for example, even layer one to layer two, right? So we kind of give an example of there's Ethereum, which is a layer one, and then there is, let's take Let's take Polygon as a layer 2. If I need to send money from layer 1 to layer 2, I have to kind of pass by a bridge. And what the bridge does is, let's take the example of you trying to get USDT from Ethereum to Solana. Okay? How does it work? So you can't just like print USDT on the second chain, right? Okay, so I have money on Ethereum and then I need to have money on Solana. So what needs to happen technically with a lot of bridges, that's the way it works, is that the USDT you send to the bridge gets burned or destroyed, and then new USDT on the new bridge gets issued such that the total USDT is the same. That's kind of what you use for bridging. Now, bridging has its own challenges. If we talk about Ethereum as a decentralized thing and Solana as a decentralized thing, the bridge is usually an attack vector because it's not decentralized, because there's like two things that have to happen on different chains, and usually bridges are centralized.
Does that now cost more gas to send money via different protocols, or does that money disappear um, if there is no bridge? I guess I'm asking two questions at the
If
same
there is
time.
if there is if there is no bridge, you can't send money between different protocols,
Hmm.
right, or between different blockchains, right? If there is no bridge, you cannot, in any circumstance, take money on Ethereum and send it to Solana. So you need a bridge,
Right.
right? And the bridge is usually run by a company or by a foundation
Mm.
because, as I said, it can't be done on chain. It's not something you do on chain because chains don't necessarily talk to each other. Now, there are super interesting protocols, uh, such as, let's go, Paul. Uh, let's go, Paul. Chainlink, right? So Chainlink is one of the OG projects in the blockchain. And one of the promises of Chainlink is to kind of be able to actually run things across different chains in a decentralized fashion. But as far as I know, as far as I remember, they haven't kind of pulled that part off yet. So then you're relying now on an organization to basically take your money and burn it on one side, and then take your money and issue it on the other side.
Gotcha.
And that's kind of the concept of bridge.
Gotcha. Makes sense. Bringing that back to the categories, just to list them off again. We have our foundational blockchains, we have DeFi, we have GameFi, shitcoins, NFTs, crypto AI. Anything else that we're missing that's pretty major?
So let's go through the interesting one. Layer ones, we covered them. Smart contract platforms, I think I wouldn't go into them. I'll just say, for ease of this conversation, let's treat them as similar to layer ones. Stable coins we covered, we talked about. Exchange-based tokens is just like DEXs or decentralized organizations. Centralized exchanges is CEXs. This is the Coinbase, right? Like Coinbase is considered a centralized exchange. If you're in Canada, Newton is considered a centralized exchange. Kraken is one of the big names. Binance is one of the big names. These are centralized exchanges. And the reason, the
Mhm.
difference between centralized and decentralized is it really a company doing things in the real world? That's what we call the CEXs. DEXs are decentralized. DEXs is, think of it as an exchange, but there's no people. It's a project, it's a blockchain protocol, or it's all managed by smart contracts. And DEXs are a world in itself, because how does it work, right? Um, Especially in blockchains like Ethereum, it's very expensive. Man, I don't know if we want to I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit hole about exchanges. Uh, let's cover some other categories. So we talked about gaming. AI we kind of covered. Zero knowledge is something worth getting into. Storage is another interesting one. How do we
Mhm.
store? So blockchains are really, really good at storing transactions. Wonderful. But how do I store? Let's say I need to store files. I need to store pictures. How can I do it in a decentralized way, right? Today, if I need to store pictures, either it's on my computer or on Apple's cloud or on AWS or on Google Cloud. How do I do it in a decentralized fashion. And there's a whole bunch of protocols that are tackling that problem. The biggest ones that people should be familiar with, Filecoin, and I think Filecoin will do phenomenal this year. There's a lot of things, there's a lot of narratives around Filecoin this year. Arweave is a very interesting one. In fact, most NFTs on Solana use Arweave as the kind of backing storage to store the NFT picture. What else we want to talk about? Play to earn is kind of synonymous with gaming. Metaverse was also a big narrative in last year, and I think it will probably continue. AMM, this is when we talk about the DEXs or the decentralized exchanges. This is where there's like what we call them automated market maker protocols. I think because we have them here as a category, maybe it's worth to geek out a little bit. In a centralized exchange, right? Like let's say, or to take an example of me going to buy stocks, right? What happens is there's what's called in an exchange is called an order book. So Shukri needs to buy an asset. So Shukri puts an order and says, hey, I want to buy Tesla stock for $500. That order sits there, does nothing until Anatoly, for example, puts an order and says, hey, I want to sell Tesla for $499. And when I have the order from Shukri and the order from Anatoly, the exchange algorithm will say, oh yeah, I see an order at this price, I see a matching order on that price, and now boom, I can close these orders together, send Shukri his Tesla stocks, send Anatoly his US dollars, and everybody's happy. That's how a typical centralized exchange runs, right? That's how Kraken runs, that's how Binance runs, etc., etc. Then you go into decentralized exchanges, and let's talk specifically about decentralized exchanges on Ethereum. Okay, keep in mind, it's as we said, Ethereum is really, really good at storing transactions, but in this case, it's not a transaction, and it hasn't happened as a transaction. We need to maintain an order book, right? Like if we want to implement an exchange on Ethereum, we have to kind of create an order book that holds the orders and tries to match them. That's very, 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 very expensive to run on an Ethereum. So Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, at some point sits down and proposes an alternative approach to doing that kind of exchange. And so most of decentralized exchanges, they don't run based on order book system, they run based on what we call an AMM or automated market maker protocol. Without getting into the nuance of that, because if I want to explain this, we're probably going to be like a 3-hour conversation by itself, because there's a lot of math that happens behind it. But the easiest way to think about it is Shukri and Anatoly can come and provide liquidity by putting a token pair. So let's say and this allows me actually to make money. And this is one of the big things in DeFi is that in centralized exchanges, maybe I have a way to simplify it. In centralized exchanges, right, we said there is, somebody puts a sell order, somebody puts a buy order, and they're matched. But on some days, there's not enough orders. And that's what we kind of usually refer to as liquidity or the depth of the market. There's not enough. So then a centralized exchange can go to somebody rich like Warren Buffett or some other big organization, say, hey, can you please let me borrow your stock? And I promise to pay you handsomely after. And in the AMM, something equivalent happens, is where you say, hey, I'm going to let you, SushiSwap. SushiSwap is kind of one of the kind of DEXs, or Uniswap. And I'll go to Uniswap and say, hey, I want to make some money. I have some ETH lying around and I have some USDC lying around. I'm going to go put it in a liquidity pool. And now I provide the liquidity to that market to carry out this buy and sell order. Now, there's no such thing as free lunch. Of course, I'm going to make some money, but there's also risks associated with that approach, because if the market is extremely volatile, there are certain imbalances that could happen. And we this is where there's a concept, what's called impermanent loss, which could happen, and that will kind of make you lose some money. So that's AMMs. I don't think we should cover it more. Then there's the concept of oracles. Oracles allow a blockchain to interact and exchange data and information with the real world. For example, let's say I let's say you and I want to bet on certain things. Let's say you and I need to bet on the weather, right? So you say, listen, it's going to be 20 degrees or 72 Fahrenheit for the people listening in the US. And I'll say, okay, fine, you know what? I'll bet you $50. It's not going to be 72, it's going to be 71. So the betting portion is already there on the blockchain. You can do that today. But how do I get the temperature? Because again, if you think about the blockchain, everything is a smart contract. Everything is code, there is no people. So how do we allow for the exchange of information about real world things, events that happen, and codify it back into the blockchain? And these are what we call the oracles. Now, Chainlink, remember that I told you earlier that Chainlink wanted and could do certain things or would enable people to do things cross-chain. And if you think about cross-chain, one way to think about it is very similar to an oracle, is that there's a real treat chain 2 as a real world thing and treat layer the first blockchain as the main chain. And so an oracle would facilitate, hey, did this thing happen on chain 2 or no? Oh yeah, it happened. So then go do thing in this chain, right? So this is where an oracle will facilitate the interaction between either real world things and a blockchain, or blockchain 1 and blockchain 2 that don't normally talk to one another. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think this session that we're having today is the most in terms of acronyms and concepts that are foreign to me. Like a lesson like this, I haven't had a lesson like this in a while where it's like these concepts are so foreign, it's like 100% new. And I love it because I'm learning a lot right now just by picking your brain. I want to go a little bit back to metaverse because metaverse was a massive, massive topic, especially backed up by Meta. Um, can you just elaborate on the metaverse? Because there was a lot of hype around it, and I'm still not catching on to the whole value prop of it. Is it even backed up by Meta? How does it work? Is the hype around it this bull season?
I don't think the metaverse is going to be part of the hype this post season, but again, I might be wrong. Uh, the metaverse, first of all, the concept was not invented by Meta. I would argue Meta capitalized on what was happening in the blockchain and renamed and reframed to Meta. The concept. Now let's try to understand what is the concept of the metaverse in the first place. And if people want to wrap their head around this in an easy way, there's a movie called Ready Player One. I think you should go watch it, right? Because I think it kind of describes, to a certain extent, a future when you can jump into the metaverse. And the metaverse,
It's a great
think of it
movie.
as if, yeah, it's a great movie. So the metaverse, the concept or the premise behind it is, as opposed to us living, you and I living in the real world, what if we can kind of jump into a virtual 3D world and do things there? I think my kids and your kids and whoever's watching and listening to this, our kids understand it intuitively. Roblox, you can argue that Roblox is metaverse, right? You could also argue that when you jump into any game, like whether it's if you guys played Counter-Strike, right? What happens in Counter-Strike is you jump into a world or into a metaverse, and in that metaverse you just happen to be, player versus player shooting one another. So the idea of the metaverse is being able to kind of be transported into a virtual world, and now you're living in it, and now you can do all sorts of things that you can do in the real world, but do it there. You can buy buildings, you can run ads. You can open a shop, you can sell virtual services, and that's kind of the premise of a metaverse, is that you can jump into this world and now you get to engage in all sorts of activities. Now, this was huge in the previous bull run. I don't think the metaverse is something. I think people, had enough with the previous bull run on it. So I don't know if we're going to see another run with it.
So it's more so
We
the
talked
concept
about
around having virtual property um, and existing within this virtual sphere, but for someone that is pretty, like, let's say, pretty disconnected and wants to stay within the real world, um, is there any advantages being in the metaverse, or you literally have to be part of this virtual space in order to reap the benefits?
when you say is there an advantage, maybe can you elaborate more? Like, for example, I would argue that if I know what metaverse is going to be a hit, I'm going to go buy land there. Like similar to what you do
Mm,
in the real world, right? Like if I go back, 200 years and I knew that Toronto is going to be Toronto, I would have invested in a ton of real estate, right?
mhm.
Now, but you also can get into very interesting problems when you're talking about metaverse, right? Unlike Earth land is limited, truly limited. You can't make more land. But if I consider the metaverse, like, Sandbox or Mana, so then they can always print more land, right? You can always create more virtual land, and so
Right.
it's trickier to justify the kind of the investment in metaverse real estate. But I would also argue that the projects themselves, Sandbox or any other metaverse, they want to also create that kind of rarity aspect, right? So you always have you'll want some pieces of land to be more valuable than others. Otherwise, you create no incentive for people to buy. So we talked about gaming, and gaming, the big cases are like really play to earn, right? So the famous example that everyone must have heard of by now is Axie Infinity.
I've never heard of it.
Cool. So man, that's a whole other world. So maybe we'll jump into it a little bit. So a very easy way to explain kind of the gaming or the play to earn narrative is today you play some games, and in these games you might have to go and buy, you actually use your credit card. Like, let's go back to Roblox, right? Let's take the example of Roblox and my kids. So my kids are always coming to me and like, hey, can you buy me Robux? Okay, why do you need Robux? Oh, because there's this really new cool skin that I want, or this fancy house that I have to put in Roblox. And so today we already buy skins in games, like buy power-ups. Great. And when I play the game, I could also earn points, right? And these points might, give me a power up, or I can redeem them towards other things. So think of GameFi as all of this done, but it's done on the blockchain. And one of the most famous games of all time in the last bull run was Axie Infinity, where I go in and buy a character, more or less. I'm simplifying here, there's a lot of nuance there. But you go buy a character, and then you can train it, and then you can make it better, and then you make it fight other characters, and based on that, I'm actually going to be earning money. Is that
Gotcha.
okay?
I don't know.
So that's
It
gaming.
makes complete sense. It just when you mentioned gaming and the Roblox points and buying skins in the game, like that throws me back, right? Um, like as a kid, I played a whole bunch of shooters and um, games like Team Fortress, Crossfire, and I would always go. As a kid, I would have the piggy bank, and my dad would always drop coins in there at the end of the day, just from doing work, making purchases. He would always drop coins, and I would collect these toonies and loonies, and once a month I would accumulate to like $20 worth of coins, and I would always when you mentioned the Roblox points, it threw me back to going to 7-Eleven once a month and getting super, super excited because I get to buy like a card um, with Crossfire dollars on it and then spend it on skins. For whatever reason, that was just such a prominent memory from my childhood because it felt like I was almost committing a crime buying points for video games. It was really, really funny. Um, but just a memory that stood out in my head when you started
It's
talking
really
about
cool, man. I
Roblox.
can tell you, my kids have a lot of fun, and a lot of times, like one way I play with my kids, they actually take me on rides. I'm like, hey, I don't know anything about this. Take me to your world, right? So they love it when I go and gonna join Roblox, and they actually walk me around the world that they built, and they take me to their house and they show me their house. And hey, Dad, look, here's how what I created. Here's my bedroom. Here's look at this kitchen. Look at this fancy house. And to them, I would argue it kind of feels real, right? It feels, and they get to play and maybe do dangerous things in a virtual world as opposed to the real world. Now, again, no judgment on good or bad, but I always want my kids to balance
Mhm.
real world and virtual world and kind of remember, hey, there's still layer zero reality
Yeah.
that's there, and so you want to be immersed in that and not be too immersed in the virtual world because you kind of tend to it can suck you in, man. It's bad. It's bad.
Oh, it sucked me in. I had a really bad video game addiction as a kid. It peaked when I was around 12 with Modern Warfare 2. Um, but there's a lot less of that distinction between the real and the virtual as a kid. It may have to do maybe with just the level of creativity that kids have. Um, but it sucked me in back. It sucked me in bad back in the day. But I totally relate to that.
And I argue that the more advanced we become, it becomes more dangerous because the quality of the graphics are slowly becoming indistinguishable from the real world, right? That's why I say, if you go to Ready Player One, I think this is where it's going to get really blurry and really confusing. Is imagine that you're being able to get immersed in a 3D world that looks as good and less pixelated and as clear and as HD as the real world, and being able to experience. Like, keep in mind, the technology is not there yet to be able to experience beyond the visual. Like the auditory, can I hear certain things? Like, I have visual, I have audio feedback, but soon, and I actually read something the other day. Google is working on a way for smell, for the sense of smell. So imagine what's being able to smell, what's being able to taste, what's being able to physically, get punched
All the
in
senses.
a virtual world and feel it. Like, immerse your five senses in that. That'd be
Mhm.
really interesting.
I think we covered quite a bit of ground today. I want to leave this here, and I want to have at least one more episode of us getting deeper into crypto and the trending topics like crypto AI for this bull run.
The other one that I think is going to be a big narrative is social fi,
Social
to
fi.
social networks.
Haven't even heard of
That's
that one,
another.
but we'll
I
save it
think
for
that's
the
going to be
next
another
episode
big
then.
narrative in this. Sorry.
We'll save it for the next episode then.
Yeah, sounds great.
Awesome.